Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all of our witnesses, and Mr. Whitfield, our deepest condolences to you on the loss of your mother, who sounded like an incredible person. We've been talking a lot about the ideology that drives the kinds of mass shootings in our country, but in listening to some of the responses to questions, I think that a large factor and a large part of the kind of mass shootings that occur in our country has to do a lot with, regardless of ideology, with the easy access to guns that we have in our country. I'd like to ask each of you, do you agree that the easy access to guns is a significant driver of and a factor in mass shootings in our country? We'll start with you, Mr. Whitfield, and go right down the line.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, absolutely. Gun access is certainly a driver of this violence. It's certainly a large part of the problem. But I would say that it comes under the banner of white supremacy. It's just one of those things that are contributing to it. And there's a lot of other things, that would come under that banner.
We can even set aside the ideology, although I agree with you that the rise of white supremacy in our country is a huge part of it. Mr. Turley.
Thank you, Senator. There's no question. I mean, we have a country awash with guns. We have hundreds of millions of weapons in the country. The task that I'm working with a lot of members with right now in terms of finding a way to do that constitutionally, there are limits, and we're waiting for a major decision from the Supreme Court that may give us some insight into what the range of movement can be under the Second Amendment.
Well, we know that the Supreme Court has acknowledged that there are certain limits that we can place on Second Amendment rights. Professor Pape, do you agree that our easy accessibility to guns?
Without a doubt. Since 2015, we have 5 mass shootings around the world related to the Great Replacement, killing many people. 4 are in the United States. That is almost surely due to the easy access of weapons that can kill 10 and more in a very rapid period of time compared to the rest of the world.
Mr. Herdman?
Senator, every case that I described for the committee involved at least the contemplation of acquiring firearms or the actual attempted or acquisition of firearms. So they do, like they do with any other type of violent crime on the federal level, when we're dealing with federal firearm statutes or federal terrorism offenses, we're almost always looking at a gun at the center of that violation.
So you'd agree that easy access to guns in our country is a problem?
I'm not, the characterization of easy access is one that
it's relative, but it's pretty easy in our country compared to a lot of other countries.
I only pause because there is one case that I'm thinking of where the individual did not purchase a firearm because they had a prior felony conviction. It was one of the cases I discussed here today.
Mr. German?
Yes, I believe the easy access to firearms is a contributor to mass shootings, and I would point you to writing my colleagues, the president of the Brennan Center, Michael Waldman, and Brennan Center fellow Eric Rubin have produced on this issue.
So based on the relative unanimity of acknowledging that easy access to guns in our country really contributes to these kinds of horrific shootings, that we should do something about to provide limiting who can get guns and limiting access to guns. Professor Pape, you mentioned that you noted in your testimony that violent populism is rising in our country. Do you think that this trend is going to change anytime soon? And if not, why not? If so, why?
If we don't do anything, if nothing changes, I'm worried that, yes, it's going to continue into the future. A point about guns, ma'am, if I may. We are now in the worst of both worlds. We are pushing gun legislation that will almost surely not pass. That's just my view as a political scientist. But what it's doing, and this is according to our data on our nationally representative surveys, is that it is making those individuals who would have the violent sentiments even more concerned and more dangerous. So we need to be aware that it is not a free move to simply call for legislation on guns that goes nowhere, because there are many people in those 18 million that I point out who are already concerned the federal government is coming for their rights. So if we push legislation which goes nowhere, what we're doing is inflaming the problem more than we're solving it. Very important to see that's inside of our data. If we go forward and look at the next several years, the system, as I was just explaining to the other senator, we have a system now where once these dangerous ideas are in the mainstream, there are incentives for mainstream media figures and mainstream politicians to propagate them even more. And those incentives are not exactly they want violence as much as there are benefits. And we've seen this in other countries, in India, Northern Ireland, where politicians and media figures push dangerous ideas to gain votes or to gain media popularity, and they accept or they don't notice or they don't understand that it's also creating violence as a byproduct. That's what's dangerous about the next few years. As we go forward, we have created a system now where these ideas are in the mainstream. They're no longer in the fringe, and there are incentives for both political leaders and media figures to continue to propagate those dangerous ideas.
I agree with you, Professor, that this is a complicated situation. On the other hand, if we, I realize there are a lot of attitudinal cultural things that are going on in our country that leads to the kind of violence we see. On the other hand, if we do not enact some kind of legislation, for example, Hawaii has some of the strictest gun safety laws, and note that Hawaii has the lowest incidence of gun violence of any other state. There is a cause and effect going on here. So if we propose legislation, I agree with you that if we don't enact gun safety legislation, that just, I would say, tends to exacerbate the situation. But what if we actually passed some of these laws? I think it would be a big help, don't you?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Hirono. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and thank you for holding this important